going to interview George Mendel, also known as the father of genetics. Hi, Gregor.
Thank you for having me.
So, Gregor, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your research.
Okay.
What did you use to create genetics?
Well, I experimented with pea plants.
And what did you find in this experiment with pea plants?
There were a lot of things I found in this experiment. I found that there were two kinds of traits, dominant and recessive. I also found out individual inherits traits from each parent. Also, the inheritance of each trait is determined by your genes, and your genes are passed on to your offspring.
Continuing on the topic of inheritance, can a trait be passed even if the trait does not show up in an individual?
It actually can. Just like some people can have the trait of having, let's see, a big nose from their grandpa. But his or her dad or mom doesn't have a big nose. This is because his or her parents' traits don't show up, but it is still passed down.
What about dominant and recessive traits that are different?
Well, dominant allele are most likely to be expressed, whereas recessive alleles aren't expressed generally. There are both alleles, and sometimes they are paired together, but the dominant allele takes charge and determines the trait.
And based on your experiment on pea plants, the characteristics of an organism, what are they determined by?
I believe the inheritance of units or factors from both parents determine the characteristics of an organism.
And in your experiment, how did you know that we got our traits from our parents?
Because I tracked the segregation of parental genes and their appearance in the offspring as dominant and recessive traits. The mathematical patterns of inheritance from one generation to the next was very familiar.
And Mendel, what did you do with the pea plants to keep track of the traits?
I grew about 10,000 pea plants to keep track of the traits and types.
How did you work with pea plants?
Since they're easy to grow and they have many traits, they also grow fast. With a lot of offspring in each plant, I could easily cross or self-pollinate them, which gave me more control over the plant.
And what was so different about animals that you couldn't work with them?
Well, it's almost the opposite of a plant. You can't grow an animal that fast, and I don't have enough control to self-pollinate the animals. They had a lot of traits, and even more than the plants, but it will mix up my experiment too much.
When two different alleles combine?
Well, I call them heterozygous and homozygous.
Can you tell me what are the difference between homozygous and heterozygous?
I can. Homozygous is when two alleles in a genotype are the same, like two dominant and two recessive. Heterozygous is two alleles in the genotype that are different, and that can only be one dominant and one recessive combined. But the dominant always overpowers the recessive trait.
What information did you find when you experimented only 4 pea plants?
Well, I found out that only one of the 4 plants were heterozygous recessive alleles, and another was a purebred dominant, and 2 of the 4 plants were both hybrid.
What did you experiment with?
I experimented with the shape of a pea and the pod, the plant's height, color, the shape of the seed, and the flower.
How did you become interested in science?
Well, I was an Austrian monk and biologist. I loved to work with plants, and later on I discovered the rule of heredity.
Which offspring would be a heterozygous dominant or homozygous recessive, etc.?
Well, I used probability to determine the offspring.
Well, we are done for today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hi, Gregor.
Yeah.